So for somebody with my skin tone to get up on stage, perform a monologue about how I'm a black guy while I am simultaneously potentially about to rob an actual black person of the chance to go work with world-renowned professionals on this stuff, what word is there to describe that other than stealing? Hey folks, welcome back. Now, listen, I'm sure there is a very specific reason you clicked on this video, so I just wanted to clear the air in case anyone was confused. I am not proud of this. It's something I've reflected on for years, and I've been meaning to make a video about it basically since I started this channel. I figured now was as good a time as any to share my experience as a part of a wider conversation about equity in the arts and fair casting and all that. And perhaps more importantly, to turn you guys on to my favorite playwright of all time. So let's start there. The playwright at hand is a guy by the name of August Wilson. His big claim to fame was a 10-play series, often called the Century Cycle. It was a series of 10 plays. Each play in the 10-play cycle focused on a different decade of American history, specifically a different decade as it relates to African American history. So the first play, Gem of the Ocean, is about a group of black people in Pittsburgh who, because of the Great Migration, are like just entering this region, and they're kind of dealing with the trauma of having just been terrorized out of the South and, you know, adapting to this weird new northern industrializing city. And the cycle goes all the way up to the 1990s. Radio golf is the conflict between entering the middle-class corporate world and keeping true to your roots. And each play is such an interesting character study and sort of encapsulation of the time period. One of his greatest qualities, though, is the level of nuance he uses when he unpacks the sort of important struggles and themes of each time, but not in your typical hackneyed, centrist kind of both sides way. Like, for example, the play Two Trains Running takes place in the 1960s and is very specifically kind of talking about the Black Panthers, and it manages to have a nuanced conversation about all that without ever going full conservative like, oh, they're terrorists, lock them all up. The main character who voices a sort of skepticism towards the Panthers in the play is really warning about sectarian divisions, with the iconic line being, "Black people killed Malcom." His plays act as a form of a Socratic dialogue, and in the case of Two Trains Running, it becomes a really interesting discussion on the pros and cons of direct action. Also, in a character sense, less than a strictly political one, a play like Fences is not unaware of how rude and abusive Troy is, but it shows how the racist world he grew up in made him the man he is today. Fences doesn't excuse Troy's behavior, but it does, in a nuanced way, try to understand the roots of his behavior. It's really great, engaging stuff. So, that was him, good ol' Augie Willie. And one fun fact about August Wilson is that while he was from Pittsburgh, most of his plays had workshop performances in Seattle, which just so happens to be my hometown. After his passing, theaters in the area, feeling a dedication to the man, were heavily involved in attempts to honor his legacy. One of the solutions was to get involved in a monologue competition based around his work. And this is a thing that happens with, other authors like Shakespeare, where you have these competitions or ceremonies where people get around and share specific monologues from a specific author. The only problem with doing that in Seattle is that you end up with a bunch of white Seattle kids performing the monologues of black people. That's a problem. Quick point that I, at the 11th hour, realized I need to clarify. The reason white kids inevitably embodied black characters on stage is because there are no monologues from white people in August Wilson's plays. There are white characters, for sure, but they didn't have any good dramatic monologues, so it was basically inevitable that if you were in the competition, you were performing the words of a black character. So the way the competition worked is that a bunch of schools could opt in to this competition. The top 10 of those students were selected to go to the regional semifinals. Now, as you just saw through the clips, he has great monologues, some of which have sort of a universal context, like while Rose's monologue about "I'm standing here with you" is certainly specific to her being a black woman, there is nothing textually that makes that specific monologue of hers exclusive to the story of an African American woman, like, plenty of women have stayed around in unfulfilling marriages. So even though, again, Rose's circumstances are very much informed by living in a segregated society, the strict text on the page, one could argue, is non-specific to her context. Now that would be its own sort of thing to unpack if the competition were just a collection of these vague universal monologues, but that's not the context we're talking about today. You see, in a 10-play cycle about the African American experience, there are a lot of speeches about what it's like to be African American. Some of them talk openly about hate crimes being committed against them or their loved ones. Some of them are explicitly about how being black has held them back, and some of them even use the N-word. And I'll leave you to guess which of these monologues were the most popular with the white kids. Now, full disclosure, none of the white kids performing these monologues were in makeup. That would be its own level of disgusting if we were full minstrel mode up there. But still, I don't think the lack of the makeup makes that any better. And let me explain why. We were embodying these characters on stage that we didn't really have any business portraying. We didn't have any way to connect to them. My second year, I did a monologue about a black guy whose white girlfriend accused him of sexual assault when her racist white father found her having sex with the black guy. And then in retaliation, he goes and kills her as an act of self-proclaimed defiance against a racist system because he didn't want to be falsely labeled a sexual assaulter. He wanted the truth to be out there. So I ask you, how the fuck am I supposed to relate to that? The story of a guy murdering somebody as an act of defiance is not my story to tell. And if you think I'm off base or being like reverse racist to say that I can't play a black guy, let me give you a clear example of why 17-year-old Piley had zero business playing a black guy, why I couldn't properly bring the story to life. In the first round of the competition, you're encouraged to wear businessy, professional-looking clothing, and the details are not specific. But once you get to the regional semifinals, you were encouraged, if you thought of a strong choice, to wear a character outfit. Like if you were a character who worked on a farm, maybe you would wear like a tattered farmer's outfit. So 17-year-old Piley is playing a character who in the play just got out of jail after like 20 years. And logically, the only clothes he would have to his name would be the clothes he went into prison with. And my mind thought it would be a good idea to wear this flannel and a fucking Nirvana t-shirt. Hey folks, Editing Piley here. Just wanted to clarify a point that I didn't do a good job of explaining on stream. When I make fun of my costume choice, I'm obviously not arguing that black people never wear Nirvana gear. I'm sure there's an underrepresented part of the grunge community that is black. That seems to be the case with most genres in American music. Rather, the reason I think my costume choice is such a clear example of why I had no business being this character is how desperate I was to center myself. I didn't stop to think what the time period, what the city, what the person's general demeanor would have meant for their costume choice. It simply was that I wore Nirvana gear and I was like, oh, well, if I went to jail, this would be the clothing that I would come out of it with. And the costume that I developed while centering myself is just to me kind of a funny symbol of how out of touch with this character I am at my core. It just speaks to the fact that I had no connection to this person. I have never in my life even really been bullied, let alone bullied on a systemic level or on a personal level because of anything about me. Like, I had zero ways to connect to this character. And that's not something that just being more of an adult or a better actor would have given me the tools to connect to. There is just a 0% chance that I could ever relate to that story. But then the other side of the competition, which I don't think I've done a good enough job of exploring yet, is the extent to which these white people participating in the competition took opportunities away from actual black people. If you did good enough in the initial auditions, like I said, you're selected to the top 10 for the regionals. But what I forgot to mention, if you place in the top 3 of regionals, you're given a paid trip to a weekend in New York City to work with extremely famous people. Like, one year was Denzel Washington, to sort of talk about and work through these monologues. And that's a huge opportunity. And even at the regional level, you got to work with artists in your region. And I'm sure there's some students who started fulfilling professional relationships there. Like they took the coaching or got seen at the top 10 competition and were able to get jobs or make connections and that sort of thing. So for somebody with my skin tone to get up on stage, perform a monologue about how I'm a black guy who murdered somebody in retaliation to a hate crime, and then I'm sitting there taking away the opportunity for a black person to be up there telling a version of one of his stories that relates to them, while I am simultaneously potentially about to rob an actual black person of the chance to go work with world-renowned professionals on this stuff. What word is there to describe that other than stealing? Like, that's just what it feels like to me at the end of the day. And I guess I'll make clear here, if I hadn't beforehand, this was a class assignment. This wasn't a thing that I just actively chose to get into. I certainly didn't protest. I don't want to absolve myself of the sort of guilt I carry from not protesting this. But I did not actively choose this, for whatever it's worth. Like, my friends and I who participated in this competition have talked about this in the years since. If you want kids, white kids, to learn from these stories, just have them read them in class. Like, I owe so much of my current political understanding of the world to August Wilson. Like, growing up in a city that's, I think, 95% white, 92% white, it fucking blew my mind to read some of the harsh stories about the Jim Crow era, or to read, really, I think his most interesting plays are some of the post-civil rights ones, because they were, I kid you not, my first exposure to the concept that black people were still oppressed after the civil rights era was Jitney, a play that is about sort of development encroaching on these communities and buying them out, and then, just gentrification. It's a play about gentrification. That fucking blew my 16-year-old mind. So I think it was important for me to learn about this author and to read his stories. That's great. But just have the kids read the plays if that's what you're concerned about. And I get that if they had a competition, they couldn't turn the white kids away because they'd get sued. And if they only ever cast the black kids into the regional or final competition, they'd probably also get sued. But that doesn't justify the whole ordeal. If it brings a few more kids into knowing who August Wilson is, but also robs a larger number of students into not having opportunities they should probably be the ones getting, I don't really know if it's a worthwhile endeavor. And I choose now to share this shitty story from my schooling because I think it tells us a lot about where our culture is at as far as, equity and all that is concerned. Like, we think examples of white people either doing literal blackface or taking roles from minority communities is some thing of the past. But Dan Aykroyd did blackface in the 80s. How many years ago was Scarlett Johansson being an Asian woman? This shit is still a part of our culture. And it's important to note this isn't just a conservative problem, because the sort of community that runs this competition is probably pretty liberal. I mean, they're theater people after all, you kind of have to be. And still, these communities and this competition committed active forms of what I would call robbery to minority communities. Moreover, I think it's important to acknowledge how this is one of the failures of an otherwise good-natured tendency toward open casting. As in this moment, it came to the conclusion that, well, actually it's good for a white kid to be playing around in this ethereal space to embody this other person, and then proceeded to let white kids rob real-life people of color of opportunities. And I think the extent to which this mindset would lead your generic liberal person to think that this outcome is a good thing is worth kind of deconstructing. So anyways, to wrap everything up in a neat bow of, gee, this situation sucks, don't let white kids perform monologues of ethnic minorities that vent about being hate crimed against. I just think that that's a pretty reasonable bar to live life through. And more importantly, if you have opportunities to empower people from historically marginalized communities, maybe let them win those opportunities instead of letting rich suburban Seattle white kids take their place at a national level. So anyways, that's all I have to say on this subject. I hope it was interesting to y'all. Let's turn it on over to the pre-recorded outro. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to toss me a like and subscribe down below. But if you really want to help me out, you can join me over on Patreon. Patrons get access to exclusive behind-the-scenes content, like early versions of every video, and exclusive Patreon-only videos. Plus, if you join the Piley Benton's Biggest Boys tier, you get your name read off at the end of every video. Zoth, Revo Pregame, Emily, Kyle Foley, Jennifer Jones, Caffeine Unicorn, Goblin of the Year, and Cameron Fordo. So if you want to hear your lovely name read off at the end of every video, be sure to join me on this specific tier. Thanks much, everyone, and I'll see you next time.